Thank you for that very kind introduction. You have me thinking, Mazur, protocol, problem. Maybe that refers to the femtosecond hyperdoping.
Maybe.
I guess I better talk to the physics department. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here to be talking about something that's really near and dear to my heart, innovation. And I thought I'd set the stage by telling you a little story about this man, Andre Geim, who won the Nobel Prize in 2010 for physics. I bet not many people know the details, but basically what he got the Nobel Prize for was a form of matter called graphene. Graphite is made out of layers of carbon atoms, and graphene is actually a single layer of atoms of carbon. So it's macroscopic, if you want, in one dimension, and it has just atomic size in the other dimension, the thickness. The way he did that was by a technique called exfoliating, which sounds a lot more technical than what he actually did. He took or his students took a pencil, which is graphite, and rubbed some graphite on the sticky side of a Scotch tape. Then they took another Scotch tape and put the sticky side against the sticky side of that, pulled the two apart. Some graphite stuck to one side, some to the other. Threw away one, took another clean piece of Scotch tape, and kept on pulling away layers of the graphite until ultimately what was left was either completely transparent, meaning there's nothing, or slightly non-transparent, and he had essentially isolated a single layer of carbon atoms called graphene, which turns out to have many interesting properties. This is nanotechnology. You may have heard of nanotechnology on a nano budget. You know, all you need is a pencil and Scotch tape. Now, what is interesting about Andre Geim is that in addition to the Nobel Prize, he won the Ig Nobel Prize. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Ig Nobel Prize. It's basically awarded on my campus by actually some real Nobel laureates. And it's given for science that makes you laugh at first and think thereafter. Let me tell you what the Nobel Prize, the Ig Nobel Prize, pardon me, for physics was. And I have to read here because I keep forgetting. This is the title of an actual publication that appeared in the Acta Otolaryngologica. And the title of that peer-reviewed article for which the Ig Nobel Prize was given a few years ago in physics is Dizziness in Discus Throwers is related to motion sickness generated by spinning. Not making that up. Here's actually a patent for a bra that can be quickly converted into two face masks in the case of a fire, which was another Ig Nobel Prize a few years ago. And here you see the inventor trying it out on some of my colleagues on stage at Sanders Theater. Andre Geim got the Ig Nobel Prize 10 years before getting the Nobel Prize for levitating a frog. Well, what is interesting is to actually read the interview on the Nobel website that he gave when he received the Nobel Prize. For me, it's very boring to work on the same thing year after year. And he explained that his experiments that created graphene resulted from what he calls Friday night experiments, where he basically encourages his students to take the equipment that, you know, is around in the lab and to try out something wild. Interestingly enough, in one case, it resulted for him in the Ig Nobel Prize. In another case, for the Nobel Prize. So clearly, very innovative person. And the question that I'd like to address today, how can we foster this risk-taking, this sticking out your neck, trying something new? How can we foster and teach innovation? And the 2 points I'm going to make, I'm going to substantiate that a little bit more than I'm doing now, is that we should teach real problem solving. That's why I have it in italic there. Not the type of textbook problem solving that we mostly do on our students. And we should also encourage risk-taking. And as I will argue, our assessment system is often at odds with this risk-taking. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to talk a little bit about education. And this is actually a picture of me teaching my intro physics pre-med class a very long time ago. This picture was taken BC, before computers. See, I'm using an overhead projector, before the first TLT Symposium, a long time ago. Then I'll talk a little bit about peer instruction, an interactive teaching technique which I developed a little over 20 years ago to address some problems I discovered in my class. And since we're in an academic setting, I thought we should end with a test. So you better pay attention because the test will come at the end. So I want to start by asking the question, what is it exactly that happens in a lecture? Take the picture of me teaching my intro pre-med class. And you'll have to shout it out. I would like to have you tell me, describe in 1 or 2 words, I don't need whole monologues here, 1 or 2 words, one of which ideally is a verb, the activity that is happening on the screen behind me. And the 2 verbs I do not want to hear are teaching and learning. So go ahead, blurt it out. Note-taking. Sitting, listening, reading, conversation. I think of a conversation as 2 people talking to each other. From what I recall, there was very little talking back to me in that situation. Let's hear some more. Explaining. I couldn't hear that one. Attention. Okay, did I hear somebody say sleeping there? You know, these are my students, but now that you mentioned sleeping, I can't resist quoting Albert Camus, who once said, "Some people talk in their sleep, lecturers talk while other people are sleeping." No, inspiring. Notice that most of the verbs he heard refer either to me in front of the classroom or to the students. Reading, talking, listening, sitting, and so on. Can we sort of encapsulate the whole thing? This process between the students and me? Information. You must have heard my talk before. Information transfer, exactly. And you know, in a sense, what had happened early in my teaching career was that the students had rubbed this in my face, and I had ignored it. You see, when I started teaching, something interesting happened. I never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? I simply did what my teachers had done to me, and I think we all tend to do that. We tend to project our experiences on us. And since my reviews at the end of the semester were very good, I very quickly started to believe I was the world's best physics teacher. Turned out that was a big illusion. But the question that did come up in my mind was, what am I going to teach? Not how, but what? So I went to a colleague who told me that they'd used a book by the name of Halliday and Resnick for many, many years, and I adopted that book. And I was told that in the US, I was educated in Europe, that in the US, the students actually buy the textbook, and that I had to make sure that the bookstore had enough books in stock. So I went over to the bookstore a few weeks before the semester started, and I say, be sure that by September 15th, you have 150 copies of Halliday and Resnick in stock. And as I was walking back to my office, I thought, wait a minute, if the students have the book, and I have the same book, then what do I do in the classroom? So I knocked on my colleague's door, who said, don't worry, there are lots of different physics textbooks. And he showed me his whole collection of introductory textbooks. And very quickly, I found the perfect book. It was perfect for two reasons. The first one was it had a different approach from Halder and Resnick, so I wasn't just regurgitating the material to the students. But that was not the important reason. The important reason was the book was out of print. So for each class, I prepared lecture notes, which I would either project on the overhead projector or I'd write them on the blackboard behind me. And because my notes were different from the textbook, I handed out copies. Remember, this was BC, so I couldn't post them. I handed out photocopied notes at the end of class. So as my students walked out of the classroom, they could pick up a copy of the lecture notes. Why do you think I handed them out at the end of class and not the beginning? So they would stay and listen. But isn't that already admitting that there is a problem? Anyway, that never occurred to me. But you know what did happen? What happened was that at the end of the semester, a number of students wrote on their end of semester questionnaire in the comment section, Professor Mazur is lecturing straight from his lecture notes. Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? Develop another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I handed out to them? These ungrateful students, I was livid. But you know, they had a point. They had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. And if they had paid attention to the book, they would have seen that the book wasn't that different from my lecture notes. Now, this scene here repeats itself all over the globe. Whether you go from Chile to China to Europe to the US, most of our learning spaces are designed like this, and you mostly see professors deliver information in front of the classroom. So that leads to the question, is that what education is? Is education merely the transfer of information? We have no clickers, and we'll need clickers later. So instead, we're going to use a very low-tech approach, because I want to focus on pedagogy and not on technology, namely hands. And we're going to put the hands on the chest when I ask you to, with, you know, 1 finger for choice 1, 2 fingers for choice 2, 3. We can go all the way up to 5. Or you have to use 2 hands, but that gets awkward. So I'll limit my choices to 5. I'm going to ask you the following question. Oh, and by the way, if you don't vote, at the count of 3, I'm going to ask everybody to vote. If you don't put your hand on the chest indicating the choice, I will come to you with this microphone that's here and ask you to tell everybody in the room to vote, okay? Be warned. When I tell that to my students, they quickly. If you believe, which is not a strange conclusion by simply observing our teaching practices, if you believe that education is merely the transfer of information, not the way we practice this, but education as it should be, then vote 1. If you think education is more than just the transfer of education, vote 2. Ready? At the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, why don't you raise your hand so everyone can see what the distribution is? We have an overwhelming 3? There is no 3. We have an absolutely overwhelming majority for 2. I saw a few 1s there. I have a warning for those who voted 1. You are about to lose your job. Because let's face it, let's imagine for a moment, I know most of us agree that's not the case, but let's imagine that education is just a transfer of information. What would be the logical thing to do? Put it online, exactly. In fact, it's happening. What would we lose by taking all of our courses and putting them online? We'd lose our jobs, of course, but what else would we lose? Relationships. What else? Engagement. Anything else? Money for sure in our jobs. I think I heard it there, what I was looking for. Interaction. But you know how much interaction is there really in a lecture, right? I mean, I observe many lectures, and it's always the same scene. You see somebody pace in front of the class, even on a great lecture, it's dynamic, and they stop after a few minutes, and they say, does anybody have a question? Anybody? And the students look down, they don't want to make eye contact, right? And if the lecturer waits long enough, it's always the same person in the front row reluctantly raises his or her hand. So I think you'd lose very little interaction, but you would actually gain something by putting it online. Because you see, when you're listening to a lecturer, your mind is held captive by the speaking. You can't really think at a cognitively meaningful level. You can't, because if you start thinking, your mind starts wandering, and our brains can't multitask. You either listen or you think. As soon as you start thinking, you lose track of what is being said. Have you ever had in your class a student raise his or her hand and say, "Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think." It's never happened in my class, but online you could actually do that. Turns out it's not happening. Students actually put the playback speed of online videos at 1.2 or 1.3 to get through it even faster, but it could. So I think if education were just a transfer of information, then we're doomed, because there are better ways of transferring information. We've had that for 500 years, ever since Gutenberg invented the printing press. Luckily, most of you voted no. So now I need to hear from the no's. What is it? What is education more than just the transfer of information? Problem solving, applying knowledge, experience, learning how to learn. We heard lots of collaboration. We heard many things here. You need to do something with the information. It's not enough to open your skull, put the information in, close your skull, and then regurgitate it later on the exam. You need to be able to extract from the information the mental models, the interpretations, and then be able to apply the knowledge, and then be able to apply that in a new situation. I actually think that you know, even in academia, even in an institution like mine, we rarely get to applying, which is the third level on Bloom's taxonomy, for those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. We stick to remembering and understanding. By applying, I mean taking what you've learned and transferring it to another context, which is really what we want our students to be able to do, not just regurgitate what we tell them. You know, not that long ago, I was actually giving a talk at a university south of Boston in Connecticut, a very good university. I won't name any names. And after my talk, which was in the physics department, one of the physics professors came to me really excited, and he said, you know, I had something really weird happen in my classroom this year. He had been teaching physics to engineering majors, and he wanted to make the physics relevant to them. So he put it in a real world context. And the context that he chose was baseball. There's a lot of physics in baseball, right? I mean, trajectories of balls, collisions between balls and bats, runners running, you name it. So in class, he would discuss baseball problems. On the homework, he put baseball problems. On the midterm examination, he put baseball problems. When he was preparing the final exam at the end of the semester, he realized he had run out of baseball problems. So he put some football problems on the exam. Professor complained to students, we have never done any football problems. You're laughing. We should be crying about it, because unless you're able to take what you've learned in one context and apply it in a new context, you have not really learned. So it's not really the transfer of information that is important, it's the assimilation of that information. And it took a while before I really realized the lack of learning and the lack of retention in my own class. In fact, it was not until I taught the course 7 years that I read about an instrument that tests students' understanding of the concept of force. And the author of that article and that instrument to test this students' understanding of the concept of force claimed that in the southwest of the United States, it didn't make much difference whether you tested students at the beginning of a physics course or the end. They did equally poorly, clearly showing misconceptions about the concept of force. Well, I thought, no way, not in my class, not at Harvard, but I'm a scientist, so I know you better back things up with data. So I gave it to my students, and I tumbled out of my ivory tower in no time, because within 2 minutes, one student raised her hand. I walked over to her and she asked me, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught us, or according to the way I usually think about these things? I had no idea how to answer that question, and by the time the test had been completed, it was clear that I had a major problem. So it's not the transfer, it's the making sense of that information that is really the crucial step in education. Let's look for a moment at the output end rather than the input end. This picture needs no words, right? I mean, and by the way, if it elicits pleasant memories, I would like to talk to you in the break. We heard the word problem solving before. And I think that the type of problem solving that we do and our assessment practices actually further promote memorization, and they stifle risk-taking and creativity. What is a real problem? When you're facing a real problem in life, you generally know what the desired outcome is, and you're trying to find a pathway to that known outcome. So it's a known outcome, and it's a solution that's unknown. You have to give a talk in San Francisco at 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. You head to the airport to catch the last flight out to San Francisco. The flight is canceled. You got a problem. The outcome is known, the desired outcome being in San Francisco on time. The question is, how do you get there? In fact, any problem we face in our daily life, in our career, fits that pattern. We know where we want to get. It's how we get there that is a key point. You're a manager for an investment fund. I mean, again, the outcome is known, more money. The question is, how do you get there? Any type of engineering, scientific problem like that fits that pattern. How do we test our students? And in particular, I think we're doing poorly in the sciences, in the humanities and social sciences. I think we tend to do better. We give the students a problem and we ask them to apply a known procedure to find an unknown answer. A car, I'm giving you an example here. A car is going along a road, blah, blah, blah. It hits a tree, and then the question is, what is the velocity of the car just before it hits the tree? Student reads the question, thinks, oh, they want to know velocity. What are the tools that I have at my disposal to calculate velocity? There's this equation, there's that equation, there's that equation. This one I can't use because I don't know what the variables are. This one I can use. And then plugs the numbers in, turns the crank, and you get evaluated on the answer. The procedure has been memorized. Why is that so important? Well, I think it's so important because computers can do this. I carry a device on my belt called a phone, which actually can carry out procedures and retrieve information. And I predict that just as robots have eliminated assembly line jobs, so will information technology eliminate any kind of job that has to do with information retrieval or with the application of rote procedures, such as that bottom type of problem, what I would call inauthentic problem solving rather than authentic problem solving. So we should really focus on authentic problem solving. But then it's not easy because in the current way that we assess our students, it's very intimidating because solving real problems is an erratic process. You try approach 1, doesn't work. You try approach 2, it doesn't work. You try approach 3, maybe it works. Now, each time you do something that doesn't work in the traditional system, you lose points. because we're graded by points and by some rather simple accounting system rather than focusing on feedback. So in a sense, the assessment is incompatible with risk-taking and problem-solving. Furthermore, the traditional assessment really focuses on the outcome, not on the process, which is what is really important. As I said, it discourages risk-taking, and furthermore, it focuses on the individual, not the group. That picture that I had up there just a moment ago, have you ever in your professional life encountered a situation where you're cut off from any source of information and any other human being? When I write a paper about nanophotonics, there's not somebody standing next to me saying, you're not allowed to look up that paper by your colleague at Yale, you should have known that by heart. I can look up whatever I want, whenever I want. Why, oh why, do we assess our students under conditions that they will never face in their professional lives? Okay, so anyway, after discovering that I wasn't the world's best physics teacher, I struggled for a while. I thought, how can that be? I couldn't blame the students for being dumb because, they were Harvard students after all. Obviously, I could not be at fault. So for a while, I thought there had to be something wrong with the test. But some further digging showed very quickly that it wasn't the test. And the solution actually presented itself serendipitously. You see, after taking that test where the student had asked, how should I answer this question, not only was I alarmed, the students were just as alarmed by having done poorly. It was towards the end of the semester and they were very worried. So they asked me to spend an evening explaining every single question on that test. 3 hours, I went through the 30 questions. And I remember coming to a question that in my mind was really trivial, so I turned my back to them and I made some drawings on the board and drew some vectors and forces, and I said, give them the answer. Turned around, I said, by Newton's third law, this is the answer. I could see at once from their faces that they were confused. So I said, is there a question? They were so confused they could not articulate a question. You know how it is, right? If you're really confused, it's sort of hard. So I thought, this is serious. So I turned around, I raised the board. I thought, okay, I'm going to bring in some more equations because I'd given a qualitative rather than a quantitative answer. In the next 8 minutes, I managed to produce the most brilliant explanation you could possibly imagine. The whole board was covered with drawing and equations. And after the end of these 8 minutes, I turned around triumphantly, my coat jacket covered in chalk dust, only to see that they looked even more confused. And they could still not articulate a coherent question. So in a moment of despair, I don't know exactly what got into me. I knew that about half of them had given the right answer on the test. I said, why don't you discuss it with each other? And something happened. I had 250 students in my class at that time. Something happened I'd never seen. Complete chaos broke out. They all started talking. They forgot about me in front of the class. I mean, I could have walked away. They would not have noticed it. What's more, in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I thought, how can that be? I, the expert, have tried unsuccessfully in 2 different ways for 10 minutes to explain it, and in 2 minutes they just figured it out? Well, imagine you have 2 students sitting next to each other, John and Mary. Mary has the right answer for the right reasons, John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. But that's not the important point. Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. She still knows what the difficulties are that a beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur has learned it such a long time ago. To him it's so clear that he cannot even imagine why somebody doesn't get it. It's what my colleague Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge. sort of an ironic argument, because you tend to think, the more of an expert you are, the better positioned you are to try it out, to explain it, pardon me. Anyway, so when I saw that, I went, wow, I should try to use that in my classes. And I decided the next year to try something radically different. I said to myself, you see, education really is, in a sense, a two-step process. The first step is the transfer of information. I mean, no transfer of information, no education. So we have to have a transfer of information. But that's not enough. You have to leave room for the assimilation of this information, for the aha moments. Oh, I get it. Where did that happen for us, for you and for me? I've often asked myself that question. Did the aha moments occur while you were sitting in an amphitheater classroom listening to your professors? I see quite a few people shake no. I think, on occasion it might have happened. Mostly it happened outside of the classroom. So the traditional approach to teaching, the emphasis in class is on the transfer of information, and the assimilation of that information is left to the students on their own outside of the class. It worked for us, but we became professors. Most of our students are not going to become professors, and assuming that it will happen for them too is kind of a big leap of faith. So what we should really do in class is focus on the harder part, not the easier part, especially since we live in an age where there's lots of opportunities to transfer information in many different ways. So I decided right then that I would invert that sequence. I didn't think of the term flipped classroom. Somebody else did much later, but I called it inverting. Let's put the transfer of information out of class and focus on the assimilation of that information in class. Now, there's lots of discussion about the first part. I do not want to talk about that because to me that's a trivial part of education. I want to talk about what to do in class if your students have taken responsibility for the information transfer before coming to class. I'm not expecting students to understand everything. That'd be great, because then we could, forget about teaching altogether. But, at least they've primed the pump, read about the definitions, so that we can talk about the meaning of them. And the answer to that question is actually nothing new. It's teach by questioning. So what I do right now in my classes is that I'll talk a few minutes and I'll put a question on the screen. I give students time to think about that question in silence, about 2 minutes or so, depending on how difficult the question is. They can actually think because there's nobody talking, and I don't allow them to talk to each other. Then I poll them. And ideally, I try to aim my question so that somewhere between 30% and 70% get the right answer. Right? If more than 70% get the right answer, then it doesn't make much sense to have them discuss it because they'll get off task very quickly. If less than 30% have the right answer, then there are just not enough people to transfer the right information and model to other students. But if I'm in that 30 to 70% zone, I have them talk to each other. I tell them, find a neighbor who has a different answer and try to convince that neighbor of your answer. Chaos. I poll them again. We wrap up with an explanation, which can either be provided by some of the students or by me, and then the cycle repeats until class time is over. And of course, the learning takes place during that discussion cycle. Let me show you a little video clip of how this works in practice. So we have a rectangular loop that is placed in a uniform magnetic field in the direction indicated by these arrows. So the question is, what are the magnetic forces on the 4 different sides of this loop? So take a minute to think about this and then enter your answers. Please enter your answers. We have a disagreement clearly here. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can convince one another of the correct choice.
Right, it goes out of the page and the top goes in, so they cancel each other out. There is a torque. There is a torque.
How do you know that?
I said torque. What did you say? But how can it be a torque?
Initially we had sort of an even split. And now we have an absolutely overwhelming majority for choice number 2. And I do show them that second distribution, so they see the second one.
What is that?
And it's not unusual to go from 50-50 to, what was it, about 80% and 20, with 80% being correct. So what's going on here? Well, one, it's active, not passive. It is absolutely impossible to sleep through my classes because every few minutes your neighbor will start talking to you. Secondly, it's a two-way flow of information, not just from me to the students. There's information coming back. I can see it then and there on my screen if they get it or not. I don't have to wait till the midterm or even the final exam to realize that, oh, they're not getting what I had hoped they would getting. Secondly, it's continuous formative feedback for the students. They get feedback on their learning. There's no problem giving the wrong answer because there's no credit for getting it right or wrong or for participating for that matter. You know, you give students credit for participating in these questions, and the only thing you can be sure of is that their clicker will come to class. Or maybe, if you're lucky, their body too. But you cannot guarantee that their mind will come. In fact, if you look on Twitter and you look for clicker and class, it's hilarious. I mean, you can see students' points of view of clickers. You'll see students sitting in class with 4 clickers, their own, and 3 of their classmates who are not there, all because the instructor is giving points for participating in the clicker. You want there to be an intrinsic motivation and a way for them to take a risk, to try out their knowledge, to get feedback on their knowledge in an environment where they're not going to be punished for getting it wrong. The other thing is it personalizes the instruction. As the instructor, I can only give 1, maybe 2 different points of view. But here, individual students can address each other's individual difficulties. Student A helps student B. Student C helps student D, even though B and D have 2 very different problems. Something that I, as an instructor, giving the cookie cutter approach, can never do. Do you want to try it? Yeah? Okay. Did you all last night read these 2 paragraphs on thermal expansion? I asked Angie to... What are you laughing about? I see Angie getting very worried here. I'm just joking. But you know what that means. That means that I will need to lecture you about, thermal expansion, which frankly I'm very happy about because I don't get to lecture in my own classes anymore and I kind of miss it, so I can make up for it here. Thermal expansion deals with the fact that solids, hard solids, wood and steel and stone, not soft solids, not a bagel or anything that is squishy like tissue. Hard solids expand when they get hotter, and they contract again when they get colder. And this is in engineering. This is an important point. I mean, you may have been in a train at low speed and heard that there's this clickety-clack sound of the wheels as they go from one section of the rail to the other. You may wonder, why don't they just jam the sections together so that there's no gap in between them? Well, if they did, bad things happen when it gets hot. The rail expands, there's no space for the rail to expand, and it buckles. Steel beam buildings, there are many engineering applications where you have to take that into account. Next time you park your car in a concrete structure, as you walk away from your car, look down and you'll see that every 30 yards or so, there's a gap in the concrete that's filled by rubber. Why? So that the concrete can expand and compress the rubber. Otherwise, bad things would happen when the concrete expands when it gets hot. Now, the reason this happens is that solids are made from atoms. I'm showing 9 atoms here. And atoms get further away from each other when it gets hotter. So this is cold, and that is hot, cold, and hot. That's all there is to it. Now, you may wonder, why is it that they get further away from each other? I'm not going to test you on that, but just to satisfy your curiosity, the reason is that atoms don't sit still, they vibrate. And the amplitude of that vibration is what we call temperature. So these are cold atoms, and these are hot atoms. Cold atoms, hot atoms. So as the amplitude grows, they need more space, right? They just sort of push all their neighbors away. And by the way, it's not just those 9 atoms, it's all millions of billions of atoms that make up a solid. Cold and hot. Questions, anybody? I knew I was a brilliant lecturer. Thank you so much for reaffirming that. But you know, I'm not just going to black this out and then ask you, when solids get hotter, they expand because A, the atoms get further away from each other, B, they stay the same distance, C, they get closer. That would be simply me giving information to you and you giving that same information back to me. I'm going to see if you can apply this idea of the atoms getting further away from each other, all of them, and apply that to a different context. So you better ask me questions. I think I saw a hand up there. Yes?
This may be completely outlined, but why, when you're showing the further away, why do you have the gray still there? Just because people remember, or
Oh yeah, I have the gray there just so you see the original position. I could have omitted them. So it's like to remind you what the original positions was, to visually remind you what the original position was. Yes?
Does the type of material make a difference in how large the variability is between moving atoms? So when it's not like wood versus steel?
Does the type of material matter in terms of how further away the atoms get? Yes. Different materials have different what is called expansion coefficients. So for a given increase in temperature, some materials expand more, proportionally more than others. For example, metals tend to expand more than things like wood or concrete. Absolutely. On the other hand, now the questions are coming. Yes?
Are there materials that do the opposite?
I beg your pardon? Oh, are there materials that do the opposite? No. There are strange things happening when there are phase transition. If you look at the glass of water in front of you, if it has ice cubes, the ice cubes float. The ice cubes are colder than the water. If they float, it means it's lighter, therefore less dense. How can that be? Well, water does a funny thing when it goes from solid to liquid. But if you just keep ice and you forget about the phase transition to liquid and you cool the ice down further, it shrinks. And as you heat it up, it expands again until it melts, and then funny things happen, but we won't talk about that. Yes?
As the temperature increases, the expansion, is it a linear?
Is the expansion linear with temperature as the temperature increases? So in other words, you increase it by 10 degrees, it goes a certain fraction, and then if you increase it another 10 degrees, does it do that same fraction? The answer is yes, that is exactly what happens. Very good. I think you are ready. I see there's another burning question there.
Does it ever fracture or break apart at any point?
Does it ever fracture? No, it does something else. It does something called melt. So they go further and further apart, and at some point the atoms don't attract each other enough anymore, and they lose their, the bonds with neighboring atoms, and ice turns into water. Okay, one final question there. So it doesn't look as if they move away from each other. Is that because, as if it moves away from the center, you said, right? Okay, yeah. So why doesn't the atom in the center move? I'll tell you why the atom in the center doesn't move. And the answer I'm going to give you may surprise you a little bit. It's because I made 2 drawings. I made this drawing, and I made that drawing, and I slapped them on top of each other. was this was this atom on top of the gray atom. But that was a choice, an arbitrary choice. I could just as easily have taken this black atom and put it on top of that gray atom. In that case, what would have happened to this one? It would have moved down and to the right. And this one, instead of moving up, would have moved to the right. And this one would have moved twice as far to the right, and so on. The point is, after heating, they would all be further away from each other. The absolute position doesn't really matter. Remember, there's not 9 atoms, not 9 million atoms, not 9 billion atoms, not 9 million billion atoms, not 9 billion billion atoms. No, there are billions of billions of billions of billions of atoms. So the position of any individual atom is actually an irrelevant quantity. I think you're ready for the question. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read the question to you. You're going to think without talking. If you talk to somebody, I'm going to come with this microphone here and ask you to tell everybody what you just told your neighbor. Then we're going to vote, and I'm going to look around to sort of get a feeling for the vote. And then you're going to try to find a neighbor who has a different answer. So if you turn to your right and the person on your right has the same answer, don't talk to that person because, there's nothing to talk about. Say thank you very much, and you turn to the person on your left. If that person also has the same answer, get up, walk around. Your task is to find somebody who has a different answer. If you're not talking to anyone, you're just sitting there, I will come and talk to you. Are the instructions clear? Okay, so here we go. Consider a rectangular metal plate with a circular hole in it. When the plate is uniformly heated, the diameter of the hole, 1, increases. 2, stays the same. 3, decreases. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about that. And if you already made it up your mind, I already see some people who are voting. You can wait until I tell you. Ask yourself, how am I going to explain my reasoning to somebody who has a different answer? Does anybody want more time to think? It's perfectly fine. Raise your hand if you want more time to think. Okay, you're ready to vote. Wow. At the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Hands on the chest. On the chest. Don't show it. Okay, so let me keep it there for just a moment. Oh, we have a very broad distribution. Okay, very good. Okay, so go ahead. Why don't you find a neighbor who has a different answer and discuss it with each other.
I voted 2 because I initially thought, well, the diameter could increase
Now look at this. Look at this. You all got fired up. They're still talking there. I bet that by now many of you have forgotten that I am not here to talk about thermal expansion. The answer to this question doesn't matter. I already made my point. See how engaged you got. I mean, imagine I'd just given my little lecture the way I did, and instead of asking you the question, I would have said, let's now apply this to metal plates with circular holes in it. If you take one of these plates, put it in the oven, and turn up the temperature, the plate expands, and the diameter of the hole will... I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer here. You would have slept through it. I mean, what is more boring than metal plates with circular holes in it? Isn't it amazing how you can rekindle the curiosity of the human mind? I mean, if anything, I think education does a really good job at turning that off early in life. But the good news is you can turn it back on by asking a question. Now, before I tell you the answer, let's analyze what happened here. I asked you a question, you thought about it, and then I had you make a commitment. We could have used clickers, but it's not the technology, it's the pedagogy that matters. And after making a commitment, I asked you to externalize your answer, to turn to a neighbor, and something interesting happened. I could see it all over the room. You turned away from the answer and started to talk about the reasoning. It was no longer the outcome or the answer. It was the process. I saw many of you sit there, gesticulating about holes. But most importantly, you became emotionally invested in the learning process. If I were to say, oh, I gotta go, it's the break now, you'd come running after me asking what the answer to this question is. So, before I can tell you the answer, you gotta vote again. So at the count of 3, indicate what you now believe to be the right answer. So even if you've not changed your mind, you vote the same thing. If you change your mind, you vote what you now believe to be the right answer. 1, 2, and 3. It's hard to change the mind of professors, huh? I have some bad news for you. I thought I gave a pretty darn clear lecture. And so did you, because you didn't ask me any question until I told you that'd be an assignment. Unfortunately, the first time you voted, less than 30% of you got the right answer. And when that happens, there's just simply not enough people to spread the right answer. So in a sense, you've already made a very important point. Because you've been telling me, Eric, your lecturing sucks. To which I'll reply, you should have done your reading before coming to this session. The right answer is, oh, look at that. There is not one person texting, tweeting, or blogging. Everybody is looking at me. It's just amazing. I bet that by now you've again forgotten that, I'm not here to teach you about thermal expansion. I'm here to talk about teaching. The right answer is, I need a drum roll, is number 1. Look at the excitement. Look at the excitement. A metal plate with a circular hole in it. Trust me, if you can do this with metal plates, you can do it with all of the subjects that you're teaching. Now, I don't want you to lie in bed tonight at 2 a.m. awake, thinking about this question. So let me take another precious minute of my time to tell you why the hole gets larger. Imagine you have a jar of jam or marmalade or whatever in the refrigerator. It's a glass jar, a metal lid. The metal lid is a ring with a plate of one of these bowl jars, right? You take it out of the refrigerator, can't open it. What do? You run the metal lid under hot water. The ring expands the hole gets larger. You say, well, you didn't ask about a ring, you asked about a plate. Okay, let's imagine we have a plate, no hole in it. A plate, I know this is not metal, but imagine it's metal, no plate in it. Now, we take a pen and we draw a circle on the plate. So we have a plate with a circle on it. We put this plate in the oven, we turn up the temperature, the plate expands. What happened to the circle that we've drawn? It gets bigger. She said, that's unfair, there's no hole. If there was a hole, then the metal would expand into the hole. Well, let me show you what's wrong with that reasoning. Imagine that a number of us form a big circle. We are the atoms holding hands. We are the atoms at the edge of the hole. Now we step in towards the center of the hole. What just happened to the distance between us? Got smaller, we get squeezed together. It can't because, we need more space, not less space. The only way to make more space would be to remove a few of us, but atoms don't disappear like that, or to make the hole larger. You won't forget this. Back to peer instruction. In the first year that I implemented this, I doubled the learning gains. And in fact, after that, I tripled them, and instructors at many institutions have replicated the data in many different disciplines, including the humanities and social sciences, where there are no right or wrong answers. But you still have models and interpretations, and you can still think. It's not just about giving the answer, it's about arguing about it. And better retention too. So, what is it that is happening in a lecture? In a lecture, you can't really pay utmost attention. The best you can focus is on capturing the information and then think about it later. We thought about it later because we were dedicated to our disciplines. Most of our students are not. If they all became like us, we'd have a problem because the world would be covered by professors very quickly in our discipline. You come out thinking you know it, because you haven't really had time to think about it. You thought you knew it after listening to my little lecture, but you really hadn't been yet confronted with any misconceptions. You hadn't really had time to think about it. The learning process had not even started. So you come out of a lecture with this false sense of security as a student, but as an instructor too, because, there were no questions. I must have given a clear lecture. But in the end, it's just one big illusion. So, in conclusion, education is not just about transferring information. It's not about getting students to do what we do. I want my students to stand on my shoulders and solve the problems that I cannot solve, which means I have to equip them with the appropriate skills, not just with rote procedures for solving problems that have already been solved. And the only way to accomplish that is really to have active participation in the classroom. And I think I've also shown to you that with a simple switch in the approach in a large classroom, we're about 500 here, you can actually start to teach real problem solving, to focus on the process rather than on the answer. And encourage risk-taking because there's no problem if you got it wrong here, nor is there any problem if my students get the questions wrong in my class. Thank you very much for your attention.